Some truths are too dangerous for the world to hear, yet too important to stay buried. The humid Buenos Aires air hung thick with cigarette smoke and broken dreams inside El Tango Perdido, where retired footballers came to drink away their glory days. Miguel Santos sat in his usual corner booth, nursing his third coffee and watching the room with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent 20 years chronicling the beautiful game's ugliest secrets. At 53, the weathered journalist had seen everything: match-fixing, blood-doping, players whose bodies were chemical laboratories, but nothing had prepared him for what unfolded that sweltering March evening. When Diego Maradona walked through those mahogany doors, the cantina fell silent. When Claudio Caniggia followed minutes later, the tension became electric. Their confrontation started with accusations about the upcoming World Cup, escalated to Caniggia's shocking declaration about Maradona's habits, and ended with something far more sinister: a whispered reply that sent Caniggia to his knees, trembling like a man who'd glimpsed hell itself. But the real mystery began the next morning, when Miguel discovered that, according to official records, neither legend had been in Buenos Aires that night. What did Maradona whisper that broke a man known for his fearlessness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Miguel Santos had always prided himself on knowing the difference between reality and the phantoms that haunted Buenos Aires after midnight. 20 years of covering football's underbelly had taught him to trust his instincts, even when they led him down rabbit holes that respectable journalists avoided. But as he sat in his cramped apartment the morning after the incident at El Tango Perdido, staring at the notes he'd scrawled on cocktail napkins, doubt crept in like fog off the Rio de la Plata. The official flight manifests showed Maradona in Naples, attending a charity dinner. Caniggia was supposedly in Germany, negotiating a contract extension with Boca Juniors' front office. Yet Miguel could still smell the sweet cologne Maradona favored, still see the way Caniggia's hands had shaken as he'd pushed back from their table, still hear the whispered words that had drained the color from the striker's face. "Tú sabes lo que pasó en Mexico, verdad? You know what happened in Mexico, don't you?" Miguel's pen hovered over his typewriter. He'd never trusted computers for sensitive work, as he tried to piece together what those words might mean. The Mexico connection gnawed at him. Both players had been there for various tournaments, but something in Maradona's tone had suggested older ghosts, deeper secrets. His phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. The voice on the other end belonged to Carlos Mendez, his editor at Fútbol y Verdad, the weekly sports magazine that had become Miguel's home after the major papers grew tired of his conspiracy theories. "Santos, please tell me you have something for tomorrow's deadline that doesn't involve shadow organizations or phantom matches." Miguel glanced at his notes. "What if I told you I witnessed something last night that officially never happened?" A long sigh. "I'd say your coffee's been spiked again. We need clean copy, Miguel. World Cup preview pieces, player profiles, anything that won't get us sued or make us look like a tabloid." After hanging up, Miguel walked to his window overlooking Avenida Corrientes. 5 years ago, he'd stood in this same spot, coming down from his last cocaine high, making promises to himself about the man he'd become. The irony wasn't lost on him. His addiction had nearly destroyed his career, but it had also given him insight into the pharmaceutical web that had begun ensnaring Argentine football. He recognized the signs because he'd lived them. The terror in Caniggia's eyes hadn't been about money or women or any of the usual scandals that plagued footballers. It had been the specific horror of someone whose secrets were being laid bare by someone who possessed intimate knowledge of their shame. Miguel pulled out his address book, a battered leather tome filled with contacts accumulated over 2 decades. If the official channels claimed the meeting never happened, he'd have to rely on the unofficial ones. His first call went to Rosa Delgado, a bartender at El Tango Perdido who'd worked there since the Carter administration. "Rosa, it's Miguel. About last night. I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong number." Her voice was tight, rehearsed. "Rosa, we've known each other for 15 years. You served me coffee while I watched." The line went dead. His second call, to Jimmy El Flaco Morales, who'd been sitting 2 tables away during the confrontation, yielded similar results. Jimmy claimed he'd been home all evening, watching telenovelas with his wife. By noon, Miguel had called 8 witnesses, 8 people who had sat in that cantina, who had seen what he'd seen, who had heard Caniggia's accusations and watched Maradona's devastating response. 8 people who now claimed to have been anywhere but El Tango Perdido the previous evening. The walk back to the cantina took 20 minutes through the bustling streets of San Telmo. Miguel had made this journey countless times, usually in pursuit of stories about aging players who'd found refuge in the bar's shadowy corners. But today felt different. The city seemed to be watching him, evaluating his next move. El Tango Perdido looked smaller in daylight, its mahogany facade weathered and unremarkable. Inside, the same dusty photographs of football legends lined the walls, the same scarred wooden tables bore the rings of 1,000 glasses. Miguel approached the bar where Fernando, the day manager, was polishing glasses with mechanical precision. "I need to see last night's security footage." Fernando didn't look up. "Camera's been broken for 6 months. You know that." Miguel did know that. But he also knew that Fernando had installed a backup system after the break-in 2 years ago, a small digital camera hidden behind the mirror. He'd seen Fernando check it obsessively, paranoid about employee theft. "Fernando, look at me." When the manager finally raised his eyes, Miguel saw something that chilled him more than the morning's phone calls. Fernando's pupils were dilated, his movements too controlled, like a man fighting to maintain composure under chemical influence. "There's no footage, Miguel. There's nothing to see. Maybe you should find a different story to chase." Walking home, Miguel realized he was no longer investigating a confrontation between 2 football legends. He was pursuing something that powerful people desperately wanted to remain buried. The question was whether his 5 years of sobriety had made him strong enough to face whatever he might uncover. Miguel's hands were still trembling when he reached his apartment building on Avenida Corrientes. The familiar weight of his keys felt foreign as he climbed the narrow staircase to the 3rd floor. Fernando's dilated pupils burned into his memory like afterimages. He'd seen that look before, in bathroom mirrors during his darkest months, in the faces of sources who'd been convinced to forget what they'd witnessed. Inside his cramped 2-room sanctuary, the routine of 5 years kicked in automatically. Coffee first, real coffee, not the instant powder he'd survived on during his drinking days. As the espresso maker gurgled to life, Miguel surveyed the controlled chaos that comprised his world. Stacks of yellowed newspapers reaching toward the ceiling, filing cabinets stuffed with interview transcripts, and his prized possession, a 1952 Olympia typewriter that had belonged to his father. The machine had survived the dirty war, 3 moves, and Miguel's own attempts to pawn it during his cocaine years. His father, Eduardo Santos, had used it to write For la Nación until the day military censors made his political commentary too dangerous to publish. Miguel had inherited both the typewriter and the stubborn belief that truth-telling was worth the risk, even when the truth was unwelcome. His phone rang again. This time the caller was Sofia Herrera, the one person in Buenos Aires who could make him question whether any story was worth pursuing. "Miguel, you sound terrible." Her voice carried the familiar mixture of concern and exasperation that had defined their relationship for 3 years. Sofia worked as a nurse at Hospital Italiano, pulling double shifts to support her 8-year-old daughter Carmen while studying for her medical degree. She had no patience for Miguel's conspiracy theories, but she'd been the anchor that kept him tethered to sobriety when the cravings threatened to drag him under. "I'm fine. Just working on something complicated." "Everything's complicated with you." He could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "Carmen's been asking when you're coming to dinner again. It's been 2 weeks, Miguel." The accusation hit deeper than she probably intended. Carmen had become the closest thing to family Miguel possessed since his sister Elena had stopped speaking to him during his addiction years. The girl had inherited her mother's fierce intelligence and her father's absent charm, though Sofia refused to discuss Carmen's father beyond acknowledging that he'd been a mistake she didn't regret. "This weekend," Miguel promised. "I'll cook that pasta dish she likes. The one you always burn?" Despite everything, he smiled. "I'm getting better at it." After Sofia hung up, Miguel sat at his kitchen table and forced himself to confront what pursuing this story might cost him. 5 years of carefully rebuilt credibility. his relationship with Sophia, who'd already watched one man destroy himself chasing phantoms in bottles and powder, his tenuous position at Football y Verdad, the only publication willing to print his byline after the major newspapers had blacklisted him. But there was something else, something that made walking away impossible. During his worst months as an addict, Miguel had written a series of articles exposing performance enhancement protocols in Argentine youth football. The investigation had been solid, the sources credible, the evidence overwhelming. Yet within a week of publication, every source had recanted their statements. Medical records had disappeared. The team doctors he'd interviewed had suddenly become unavailable for follow-up questions. The story had died, and with it, Miguel's reputation. His editor at Clarin had called it sloppy journalism. His colleagues had whispered about paranoia and drug-induced delusions. Only Miguel knew the truth, that he'd stumbled onto something real, something worth destroying a career to suppress. The incident at El Tango Perdido felt like an echo of that investigation, the same systematic erasure of evidence and witnesses. Except this time, Miguel was sober. This time, he documented everything in real time. This time, he wouldn't let them convince him that his own eyes had lied. His notebook lay open on the table, filled with fragments of the previous evening. Caniggia's accusation, Maradona's whispered response, the specific terror in the striker's collapse. Miguel traced the words with his finger, remembering his father's advice about journalism, that the most dangerous stories were always the ones people insisted didn't exist. Outside his window, Buenos Aires pulsed with its usual afternoon energy. Street vendors hawked newspapers that would never carry the story Miguel was contemplating. Office workers hurried past, absorbed in problems that didn't involve shadowy networks or disappeared witnesses. It was a normal world, a safe world, the kind of world Sophia wanted him to inhabit. But Miguel had never been built for safety. Even before the cocaine, even before the paranoia and professional exile, he'd been drawn to the stories that lived in margins and shadows. The question wasn't whether he'd pursue this investigation. That decision had been made the moment he'd watched Caniggia collapse. The question was whether he'd be strong enough to survive whatever truth he uncovered, and whether the people he loved would still be there when the story finally ended. The knock at Miguel's door came at 4:17 p.m., precisely as he was typing the first paragraph of what he'd decided would be his most dangerous article yet. The sharp, rhythmic rapping didn't match the casual visits from neighbors or the hurried delivery boys who occasionally climbed to the third floor. This was the knock of someone who expected to be answered immediately. Miguel approached the door cautiously, his bare feet silent on the worn wooden floor. Through the peephole, he saw a woman he didn't recognize, mid-30s, expensively dressed in a charcoal business suit that seemed wildly out of place in his working-class building. She carried a leather briefcase and wore the kind of confident expression that belonged in corporate boardrooms, not cramped apartment hallways. "Señor Santos?" Her voice was crisp, professional. "My name is Dr. Patricia Vega. I believe we need to discuss what you witnessed last evening." Miguel's hand froze on the deadbolt. Nobody outside of his failed phone calls that morning should have known about his presence at El Tango Perdido. The careful erasure of the incident had been so complete that even mentioning it seemed to trigger immediate amnesia in anyone he'd contacted. "I think you have the wrong apartment," he said through the door. "I know about your investigation into performance enhancement protocols from 1989. I know about the sources who recanted their statements. And I know that what happened to Claudio Caniggia last night wasn't the first time someone collapsed after learning certain truths about Mexico." The words hit Miguel like ice water. His 1989 investigation had been buried so thoroughly that even he had begun to doubt his own reporting. Yet this stranger was referencing details that only someone with intimate knowledge of that suppressed story could know. Against every instinct screaming at him to keep the door locked, Miguel turned the deadbolt. Dr. Vega stepped inside with the confident air of someone accustomed to being welcomed into spaces where she didn't belong. She surveyed Miguel's cluttered apartment, the towers of newspapers, the typewriter, the open notebook with his scrawled observations, with the clinical assessment of a physician examining symptoms. "You're wondering how I know about your work," she said, settling into his kitchen chair without invitation. The answer is that some of us have been watching Argentine football's medical protocols for longer than you might imagine. She opened her briefcase and withdrew a manila folder thick with documents. As she spread the papers across Miguel's table, he caught glimpses of medical charts, pharmaceutical shipping manifests, and what appeared to be FIFA correspondence marked with classification stamps. Dr. Patricia Vega, World Health Organization, Special Investigation Unit, she said, producing a credential that looked official enough to be genuine. For the past 3 years, my team has been tracking the distribution of experimental compounds through international football programs. What you witnessed last night wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a systematic program that reaches the highest levels of the sport. Miguel stared at the documents, his journalist's instincts warring with the paranoia that had nearly destroyed his career. The medical charts showed blood work results for dozens of players, including names he recognized from Argentina's national team roster. The pharmaceutical records detailed shipments of compounds with names he'd never heard of, but the quantities suggested distribution far beyond normal medical protocols. "Why come to me?" he asked. "Why not take this to the major newspapers, to investigators with actual resources?" Dr. Vega's expression softened slightly, revealing something that might have been sympathy. "Because you're the only journalist who's gotten close enough to the truth to have your life destroyed for it. And because what happened to Caniggia last night means they're accelerating their timeline. The World Cup is 6 weeks away, Señor Santos. If we don't expose this network before then, what you witnessed will happen to players on the world's largest stage." She pointed to a specific document, a shipping manifest dated 2 days prior. These compounds weren't designed to enhance performance. They were designed to ensure compliance, chemical leverage, if you will. Players who know too much, who threaten to expose the program, find themselves dependent on regular doses to prevent complications. The implications crashed over Miguel like a wave. Caniggia's terror hadn't been about exposure, it had been about withdrawal. Maradona's whispered threat hadn't been about ruining a career, but about cutting off a supply that the striker's body had been conditioned to need. "What you're describing," Miguel said slowly, "would require corruption at levels that seem impossible. 5 years ago, you wrote that youth players were being given experimental treatments without their knowledge. You were called paranoid, discredited, forced out of legitimate journalism." Dr. Vega leaned forward. "Those youth players are now Argentina's World Cup squad, and their bodies remember every compound they were given, even if their minds were convinced to forget." Miguel looked at the evidence spread across his table, then at his typewriter, then out the window where Buenos Aires continued its oblivious afternoon routine. The choice she was offering wasn't really a choice at all. It was a confirmation of the path he'd already committed to when he'd decided to investigate the El Tango Perdido incident. But now the stakes were clear. This wasn't just about 2 legendary players and a mysterious confrontation. This was about the upcoming World Cup, about an entire generation of Argentine footballers, about a conspiracy that had been years in the making. The story of his career was sitting on his kitchen table. The question was whether he'd live long enough to write it. Miguel stared at the documents scattered across his kitchen table long after Dr. Vega had departed, her business card the only proof that the encounter hadn't been another cocaine-induced hallucination from his past. The medical charts seemed to pulse with implications that made his head throb, each pharmaceutical code representing another thread in a web he wasn't sure he wanted to untangle completely. He walked to his window overlooking Avenida Corrientes, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. 5 years ago, he'd stood in this exact spot at 3 in the morning, coming down from his last cocaine high, watching the city blur through tears of self-loathing and withdrawal. That night, he'd made promises to himself about becoming a different man. Sober, careful, someone who chased stories instead of chemical oblivion. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him now. His addiction had nearly destroyed everything he'd valued, but it had also given him a visceral understanding of dependency, of the terror that came when someone threatened to cut off a supply your body believed it needed to survive. When he'd looked into Caniggia's eyes the previous evening, he'd recognized that specific brand of horror because he'd lived it. His hands trembled as he reached for his cigarettes, muscle memory from darker days when steady hands had been a luxury he couldn't afford. The pack was empty. He'd been smoking more since the El Tango Perdido incident, a dangerous regression that Sofia would notice if he wasn't careful. Everything about this investigation felt like stepping backward toward the man he'd fought so hard to leave behind. The phone rang, startling him from his spiraling thoughts. Sofia's voice cut through his anxiety like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. "Miguel? You sound strange. What's wrong?" He closed his eyes, imagining her in the hospital break room, still wearing scrubs from her afternoon shift, probably exhausted but calling anyway, because she'd sensed something was wrong. Sofia possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect when his carefully maintained stability was beginning to crack. "I'm fine," he lied, "just thinking about work." "The football story you mentioned?" "Miguel, you're scaring me. You sound like you did when you were—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung between them like a sword. "When you were using, when you were paranoid, when you were convinced that everyone was conspiring against you." The accusation stung because it wasn't entirely unfair. How could he explain to Sofia that this time was different, that the paranoia was justified, that the conspiracy was real? She'd watched him destroy himself chasing shadows once before. She had no reason to believe this wouldn't end the same way. "Carmen has a school play next Friday," Sofia continued, her voice carefully neutral. "She's playing a tree in the forest scene. She specifically asked if Uncle Miguel would be there." Uncle Miguel. The title always made his chest tight with emotions he couldn't quite name. Carmen had never known her biological father, and Miguel had stumbled into a paternal role that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. The idea that pursuing this story might cost him that relationship, might cost him Sofia and Carmen both, made the documents on his table seem suddenly less important. "I'll be there," he promised, though even as he spoke the words, he wondered if he could keep them. If Dr. Vega was right about the timeline, if the World Cup really was the deadline for exposing this network, 6 weeks might not be enough time to unravel 5 years of systematic cover-ups. And if he started pulling at these threads, there was no guarantee where they might lead. After hanging up, Miguel sat at his typewriter and tried to write, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself thinking about his father, Eduardo, and the night in 1976 when military censors had finally made his political commentary too dangerous to publish. Eduardo had sat at this same typewriter, chain-smoking cigarettes and weighing the cost of silence against the price of truth-telling. Sometimes, Hijo, his father, had told him that night, the story chooses the journalist, not the other way around. The only real choice is whether you're brave enough to let it destroy you properly. Eduardo had chosen silence, and it had eaten him alive from the inside. He died 10 years later, a bitter man who traded his integrity for safety and found neither. Miguel had inherited the typewriter and sworn he'd never make the same compromise. But Eduardo had only been risking his own life. Miguel had Sofia and Carmen to consider, and a sobriety that felt more fragile than he cared to admit. The smart choice, the safe choice, would be to burn Dr. Vega's documents and pretend the encounter had never happened. He could write sports fluff for Football y Verdad, attend Carmen's school plays, and build a quiet life with Sofia that didn't involve pharmaceutical conspiracies or disappeared witnesses. The thought made him physically sick. Miguel lit a cigarette and stared at the blank page in his typewriter, caught between the man he'd been and the man he was afraid of becoming. Outside his window, Buenos Aires hummed with ordinary life, blissfully unaware that the upcoming World Cup might be built on a foundation of chemical coercion and systematic abuse. The story was choosing him, just as his father had warned. The question was whether he'd inherited Eduardo's courage along with his typewriter. Miguel's fingers hovered over the typewriter keys for what felt like hours, the blank page staring back at him like an accusation. The documents Dr. Vega had left behind seemed to pulse with their own malevolent energy, pharmaceutical codes and shipping manifests that represented more than just evidence. They were a doorway into a world he'd never be able to unsee. He thought about Carmen's laugh, the way she clapped her hands when he managed not to burn the pasta, about Sofia's quiet strength, how she'd held him through withdrawal sweats and midnight panic attacks 5 years ago without ever asking for promises she knew he couldn't keep, about the ordinary life he'd built from the wreckage of his addiction, small and careful and clean. Then he thought about Caniggia's eyes. The terror he'd witnessed at El Tango Perdido wasn't the kind that came from career threats or public scandal. It was deeper, more primal, the look of a man who'd suddenly understood that his own body had become a prison. Miguel knew that expression intimately, had seen it in bathroom mirrors during his darkest months, when even 20 minutes without cocaine felt like drowning. If Dr. Vega was right, if Argentina's World Cup squad had been systematically conditioned to depend on chemical compounds they'd never consciously agreed to take, then walking away from this story wasn't just abandoning journalism, it was abandoning 22 men who'd been turned into unwilling addicts. Miguel pulled the blank page from the typewriter and inserted a fresh sheet. This time, his fingers found the keys without hesitation. The official story will say that Claudio Caniggia was never at El Tango Perdido on the evening of April 15, 1994. The security footage will show empty chairs. The witnesses will claim faulty memories. The bartender will swear he served only tourists and regulars that night. But I was there. I watched Argentina's most gifted striker collapse in terror after Diego Maradona whispered something in his ear. And I recognized the look in Caniggia's eyes because I've worn it myself, the expression of a man who's just realized his body belongs to someone else. The words came faster now, 5 years of suppressed observations and buried instincts flooding onto the page. Miguel wrote about the 1989 investigation that had destroyed his career, about youth players given experimental treatments, about sources who'd recanted statements with the mechanical precision of men reading from scripts. He wrote about Dr. Vega's documents, about pharmaceutical shipments and FIFA correspondence, about a network of corruption that reached levels he'd never imagined possible. Most importantly, he wrote about what it felt like to be chemically dependent, about the way addiction could be weaponized, turned into a tool of control that made traditional blackmail seem quaint by comparison. The apartment grew dark around him as afternoon bled into evening, but Miguel didn't stop to turn on lights. He was crossing a threshold he'd avoided for 5 years, abandoning the safe territory of sports journalism for the dangerous waters of investigative reporting. Each sentence carried him further from the careful life he'd constructed and deeper into a story that would either vindicate everything he'd lost or destroy everything he'd rebuilt. By the time he reached the end of the first draft, Miguel's hands were shaking, not from withdrawal this time, but from the adrenaline rush of pursuing truth instead of avoiding it. He'd forgotten how it felt to write something that mattered, to chase a story that could actually change things rather than simply filling column inches. He walked to his phone and dialed Sophia's number, knowing she'd still be at the hospital but needing to hear her voice, to anchor himself before he took the final step. "Miguel?" She sounded worried. "It's almost midnight. What's wrong?" "I need you to know something," he said, staring at the completed article. "The story I'm working on. It's going to be dangerous if something happens to me, if I disappear or if people start saying I'm using again. I need you to know that I'm sober, that I'm thinking clearly, that whatever I uncover is real." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. When Sophia finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "This sounds exactly like what you said before the cocaine, Miguel, before everything fell apart the first time. I know how it sounds, but this time is different. This time I have proof." "Proof of what?" Miguel looked at Dr. Vega's documents, at his completed article, at the typewriter that had belonged to his father. Eduardo had chosen silence and died bitter and broken. Miguel had a chance to choose differently, to honor the promises he'd made to himself during those dark nights 5 years ago. "Proof that some stories are worth the cost of telling them," he said. After Sophia hung up, Miguel sealed the article and documents in an envelope addressed to the one editor he trusted completely. Then he picked up his notebook and Dr. Vega's business card, knowing that tomorrow he'd begin an investigation that would either resurrect his career or end his life. The threshold was behind him now. There was no going back. Miguel woke before dawn with the bitter taste of regret coating his tongue, the same metallic flavor that had haunted his mornings during the worst of his addiction. The envelope containing his article sat on the kitchen table like an unexploded bomb, sealed but not yet mailed. his commitment to the story hanging in the pre-dawn darkness like a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. He dressed carefully, choosing the gray suit Sophia had helped him pick out for job interviews 3 years ago, conservative enough to inspire trust, worn enough to suggest he wasn't a threat. The face in his bathroom mirror looked older than his 42 years, etched with the kind of permanent exhaustion that came from rebuilding a life from nothing. But his eyes were clear, his hands steady. Whatever else happened, he was sober. The morning air carried the scent of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs and the exhaust fumes of early commuters heading to jobs that didn't require them to investigate international conspiracies before breakfast. Miguel envied them their ordinary concerns, their predictable dangers. Traffic accidents and missed deadlines seemed luxurious compared to the path he'd chosen. Dr. Vega had suggested they meet at Café Tortoni, public enough to discourage violence but private enough for sensitive conversation. Miguel arrived 20 minutes early, positioning himself at a corner table where he could watch both entrances while reviewing his notes. The cafe's morning crowd provided perfect camouflage. Tourists studying guidebooks, businessmen reading newspapers, elderly porteños arguing politics over cortados. "You look nervous," Dr. Vega observed, sliding into the chair across from him with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to surveillance. She'd traded yesterday's clinical attire for jeans and a leather jacket that made her look more like a university student than a WHO investigator. That's good. Nervous people live longer in this business. Miguel studied her face, searching for tells that might reveal whether she was friend or enemy. 5 years of sobriety had taught him to read people's intentions in the micro-expressions around their eyes, the way they held their shoulders, the rhythm of their breathing. Dr. Vega projected competence and controlled tension, but no malice. Either she was genuinely trying to help him, or she was a much better actress than the pharmaceutical executives who'd threatened him in 1989. "I need to understand the rules," Miguel said quietly. "If I'm going to pursue this story, I need to know what I'm walking into. Who are we really fighting, and what are they capable of?" Dr. Vega ordered coffee from a passing waiter before answering, her casual manner belying the gravity of their conversation. The network has 3 primary components. First, team physicians who've been recruited or coerced into administering experimental compounds. Dr. Martinez, who treated the youth players you investigated in 1989, was just the beginning. We now have evidence of similar programs in Brazil, Colombia, and Uruguay. She opened a newspaper and spread it between them, using the sports pages to mask the photographs she slid across the table. Miguel recognized several faces, respected physicians who'd built reputations treating elite athletes, men whose medical opinions could make or break World Cup dreams. Second, she continued, pharmaceutical companies with government contracts that operate outside normal regulatory oversight. They develop compounds that don't show up on standard drug tests, substances that create dependencies while enhancing specific performance metrics. The profit margins are extraordinary, but more importantly, they provide a form of control that traditional corruption can't match. Miguel thought about Caniggia's terror, about the way Maradona had wielded knowledge like a weapon. And the third component? FIFA officials who ensure that testing protocols remain selective. Dr. Vega's expression darkened. Men who've turned the beautiful game into a laboratory for human experimentation. They're not just enabling doping, they're creating a generation of players whose bodies have been modified without their informed consent. The cafe's ambient noise seemed to fade as Miguel processed the implications. He'd assumed they were investigating corruption, but this was something more fundamental. The systematic violation of athletic integrity on a scale that made traditional match fixing seem trivial by comparison. "What happened to the other journalists who got close to this story?" he asked. Carlos Medina was found dead in his apartment in Sao Paulo 6 months ago. Apparent suicide, though he'd been investigating Brazilian players' medical records. Dr. Vega met his gaze steadily. Roberto Paz simply disappeared after publishing an article about Colombian team physicians. His family received a generous settlement and stopped asking questions. Miguel's coffee turned cold in his hands as he understood the real stakes of their conversation. This wasn't just about his career or his credibility. This was about survival in a game where the consequences of losing weren't professional embarrassment but physical elimination. "Why should I trust that you're not part of the network yourself?" he asked. "How do I know this isn't an elaborate test to see how much I know?" Dr. Vega smiled, and for the first time Miguel saw genuine warmth in her expression. "Because if I were part of the network, Señor Santos, you would already be dead." The cafe around them suddenly felt too exposed, every conversation too loud, every glance from strangers potentially threatening. Miguel's fingers tightened around his coffee cup as Dr. Vega's words settled into his consciousness like ice water in his veins. The casual way she delivered that final statement, "You would already be dead," carried the weight of absolute certainty. "So what happens now?" Miguel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "If they're willing to kill journalists, what makes you think we can succeed where others failed?" Dr. Vega folded the newspaper, concealing the photographs of compromised physicians. "Because we're going to give them something they've never faced before, a coordinated exposure from multiple angles, too widespread to silence with isolated eliminations. I have contacts at the Washington Post and Le Monde who are ready to publish simultaneously. The network's power depends on secrecy and compartmentalization. Full exposure will destroy them." Miguel felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that had once driven him to chase stories through Buenos Aires's most dangerous neighborhoods. But this time, the stakes weren't just personal vindication. They were life and death on an international scale. He thought about Sophia's warnings, about Carmen's school play, about the quiet life he'd built through 5 years of careful sobriety. "There's something else," Dr. Vega continued, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "Medical records from the 1990 World Cup squad. Look at the long-term health outcomes for players who participated in that tournament." Miguel opened the envelope with trembling fingers, scanning documents that made his stomach turn. Liver failures, cardiac episodes, neurological deterioration, all occurring in men who should have been entering the prime of their post-football careers. The pattern was unmistakable, a medical disaster hidden behind the glory of Argentina's World Cup victory. "They're dying," he whispered. "The compounds they were given created dependencies that couldn't be safely managed after their careers ended," Dr. Vega explained. "The network abandons players once they're no longer useful. Some try to self-medicate with street drugs, others simply deteriorate." Miguel thought about his own withdrawal, the months of agony that had followed his decision to get clean. But he'd chosen his addiction, had understood the risks even as he'd ignored them. These players had been made into addicts without their knowledge, their bodies turned into chemical battlegrounds they couldn't understand or escape. "How long do we have?" he asked. 6 weeks until the World Cup begins. After that, they'll have achieved their primary objective, a tournament where the outcomes are predetermined by pharmaceutical intervention rather than athletic merit. The betting syndicates alone will generate billions in profit, but the real prize is establishing this system as the new standard for international competition. Miguel's hands were shaking now, not from withdrawal but from the magnitude of what they were attempting. In 6 weeks, he'd need to build sources, verify evidence, and prepare an exposé that could bring down an international conspiracy. The impossibility of it should have been paralyzing, but instead he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the intoxicating certainty that he was pursuing a story that truly mattered. "I'll need protection," he said. "If they killed other journalists, they'll come for me too." "We have resources," Dr. Vega assured him. "Safe houses, secure communication channels, people who can help you disappear if necessary." "But Miguel," she leaned forward, her expression grave, "once you commit to this investigation, there's no going back to your old life. Even if we succeed, even if we expose everything, you'll never again be the man who writes harmless sports columns and attends children's school plays. This story will change you permanently." Miguel thought about his father, about Eduardo's choice between truth and safety, about the bitterness that had consumed him after choosing silence. Then he thought about Caniggia's terrified eyes, about players dying in obscurity, about a World Cup built on pharmaceutical slavery. "When do we start?" he asked. Dr. Vega smiled, and for the first time since entering the cafe, Miguel saw hope in her expression. "Tonight." There's a private clinic in San Telmo where they've been treating current squad members. We have a source inside who's willing to talk, but only to someone with journalistic credentials, someone who understands how to protect sources and publish safely. Miguel nodded, feeling the last threads of his careful, sober, ordinary life finally snap. He was crossing into territory where survival would depend on skills he'd developed during his cocaine-fueled years. Paranoia, hypervigilance, the ability to function while constantly terrified. The irony wasn't lost on him that sobriety had made him too trusting, too comfortable, too safe for the investigation ahead. "There's one more thing," he said. "I need to make arrangements for people I care about. If this goes wrong, I don't want them caught in the aftermath." Dr. Vega's expression softened slightly. "Family?" "Something like that," Miguel replied, thinking of Sophia's voice on the phone, of Carmen's laugh, of all the reasons he had to stay alive long enough to see this story through to its conclusion. The clinic stood like a fortress in the narrow streets of San Telmo, its Art Deco facade concealing what Dr. Vega had described as a pharmaceutical laboratory, disguised as a sports medicine facility. Miguel crouched in the doorway of a closed tango club across the street, watching black Mercedes sedans deliver their human cargo under cover of darkness. Even from 50 meters away, he could identify the silhouettes, broad shoulders and athletic builds that belonged to Argentina's World Cup squad. His notebook was already soaked with nervous sweat despite the autumn chill. Every instinct developed during his cocaine years screamed at him to run, to disappear back into the safe anonymity of his rebuilt life. But Caniggia's terrified face haunted him, and behind it, the faces of all the players whose medical records Dr. Vega had shown him, men dying in hospital beds while FIFA officials counted pharmaceutical profits. "You're thinking too much," whispered Elena Vasquez, Dr. Vega's inside source, as she emerged from the shadows beside him. The young nurse looked barely old enough to have finished medical school, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who'd witnessed unspeakable things. "Thinking will get you killed in there. You need to become someone else, a journalist who doesn't know what he's looking for, who stumbles onto the truth by accident." Miguel nodded, understanding the performance required. During his addiction, he'd become a master of deception, lying to editors, sources, and himself with equal facility. Tonight, he'd need those same skills to survive what Dr. Vega had called the heart of the operation. "Dr. Herrera runs the night shift," Elena continued. "He's been dosing current squad members with compounds that make their 1990 treatments look primitive. The players think they're receiving legal supplements and recovery therapy. They have no idea they're being turned into pharmaceutical slaves." The weight of his father's camera pressed against Miguel's chest, hidden beneath his jacket like a talisman. Eduardo had used this same equipment to document corruption in the 1960s before choosing silence over truth. Tonight, Miguel would honor that legacy by refusing to make the same choice, regardless of the consequences. "What's my cover story?" he asked. "You're researching an article about cutting-edge sports medicine for international publication. Dr. Herrera's ego makes him vulnerable. He wants recognition for his work, even if he can't publicly claim credit. Let him show off, and he'll reveal more than he intends." As they crossed the street, Miguel felt the familiar dissociation that had once accompanied his most dangerous reporting. His body moved with practiced casualness, while his mind catalogued every detail: the security cameras, the exit routes, the faces of men who might be pharmaceutical executives rather than medical staff. 5 years of sobriety had dulled these survival instincts, but they returned now with terrifying clarity. The clinic's interior was a monument to medical excess, equipment that belonged in research hospitals, laboratories that could have serviced a major university, treatment rooms outfitted for procedures that went far beyond routine sports medicine. Miguel's journalist instincts recognized the story immediately. This wasn't healthcare, it was human experimentation disguised as athletic optimization. "Señor Santos!" Dr. Herrera's voice boomed across the reception area, with the enthusiasm of someone who rarely received visitors interested in his work. "Elena tells me you're writing about the future of sports medicine. How wonderful! We're doing revolutionary things here, absolutely revolutionary." Miguel shook the doctor's hand, noting the slight tremor that suggested pharmaceutical enhancement of his own energy levels. Dr. Herrera was perhaps 50, with the manic intensity of someone who'd convinced himself that his violations of medical ethics were actually acts of scientific heroism. "I'm particularly interested in recovery protocols," Miguel said, allowing genuine curiosity to color his voice. "The Argentine squad's performance has been remarkable lately. There must be innovative treatments behind such consistency." "Innovative doesn't begin to describe it," Dr. Herrera replied, his eyes gleaming with barely contained excitement. "We're not just treating injuries. We're optimizing human potential itself. Come, let me show you something that will change your understanding of what athletic performance can become." As they walked deeper into the facility, Miguel glimpsed treatment rooms where young men who looked like professional athletes lay connected to 4 drips, their faces peaceful with the artificial serenity of chemical dependence. The sight triggered memories of his own addiction, the way cocaine had made every sensation more vivid while slowly destroying his ability to function without it. "The compounds we're using create perfect biochemical conditions for performance," Dr. Herrera explained, oblivious to Miguel's growing horror. "Increased oxygen efficiency, enhanced muscle recovery, improved neural conductivity. The players report feeling better than they ever have in their lives." "And after their careers end?" Miguel asked carefully. Dr. Herrera's expression flickered for just a moment, revealing something predatory beneath the scientific enthusiasm. "That's not really our concern, is it? We optimize them for peak performance. What happens afterward is someone else's responsibility." Miguel's hands began to shake as he understood the full scope of what he was witnessing. These weren't just athletes being doped. They were human beings being systematically destroyed for the entertainment of millions and the profit of a pharmaceutical conspiracy that reached the highest levels of international sport. Miguel's hands began to shake as he understood the full scope of what he was witnessing. These weren't just athletes being doped. They were human beings being systematically destroyed for the entertainment of millions and the profit of a pharmaceutical conspiracy that reached the highest levels of international sport. "Fascinating," he managed to say, his voice steady despite the horror building in his chest. "Could you show me the documentation, the protocols you follow?" Dr. Herrera's enthusiasm intensified. "Of course, we maintain meticulous records. Every compound, every dosage, every physiological response. It's the most comprehensive dataset on human performance enhancement ever assembled." They entered a laboratory where computer terminals displayed charts and graphs that looked more like chemical warfare research than medical treatment. Miguel's trained eye caught fragments of data, dosage levels that would have killed recreational users, compound combinations that created permanent neurological changes, dependency curves that made heroin addiction look manageable by comparison. "This particular player," Dr. Herrera said, pointing to a screen filled with Caniggia's medical data, "required special attention. He developed some resistance to our standard protocols, probably due to prior recreational use. We had to create a personalized compound that would override his existing tolerance levels." Miguel's blood turned to ice as he recognized the implication. They weren't just enhancing performance, they were weaponizing addiction itself, using players' own biochemistry against them. Caniggia's terror in the cantina suddenly made perfect sense. Maradona hadn't just threatened him, he'd revealed knowledge of a dependency so complete that withdrawal would mean psychological destruction. "The beauty of our approach," Dr. Herrera continued, completely oblivious to Miguel's mounting horror, "is that the players become self-regulating. They crave the treatments, beg for them, genuinely believe they're essential for their health. We've eliminated the compliance problems that plagued earlier enhancement programs." Miguel forced himself to smile while his camera captured everything through his jacket. Each click felt like another step toward his own destruction, but he couldn't stop. The story was too important, the evidence too damning. These weren't just medical records, they were death certificates written in advance. "I'd love to interview one of the current patients," Miguel said, "for the human interest angle. How do they describe the experience?" Dr. Herrera's expression shifted subtly, and Miguel recognized the change immediately. The doctor's enthusiasm was being replaced by something more calculating, more dangerous. "I'm afraid that wouldn't be possible. Patient confidentiality, you understand. Besides, they're in no condition to speak coherently at the moment." The casual admission that the players were chemically incapacitated sent another wave of nausea through Miguel's stomach. He thought about his own cocaine-induced stupors, the hours lost to artificial euphoria while his life disintegrated around him. But he'd chosen that destruction. These athletes had been led into it by people they trusted, men wearing white coats and medical degrees. Perhaps another time, Miguel said, backing toward the laboratory door. His survival instincts were screaming now, warning him that Dr. Herrera's demeanor had shifted from proud scientist to predatory guardian. I should probably… You know, Dr. Herrera interrupted, moving between Miguel and the exit. I've been wondering something since you arrived. Elena mentioned you were writing for international publication, but she didn't specify which publications. Could you refresh my memory? Miguel's mouth went dry as he realized his cover was disintegrating. Dr. Herrera's eyes had acquired the focused intensity of someone who'd recognized a threat, and the laboratory suddenly felt like a trap rather than an interview opportunity. The equipment around them, designed for human experimentation, took on a more sinister aspect as Miguel understood how easily it could be used for elimination rather than enhancement. Several outlets are interested, Miguel replied, trying to project casual confidence while calculating distances to potential exits. I prefer not to commit to specific publications until the research is complete. Of course, Dr. Herrera said, his smile becoming predatory. Though I have to admit, your questions seem remarkably sophisticated for someone writing a general interest piece, almost as if you came here with prior knowledge of our work. The accusation hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Miguel could see Elena through the laboratory's glass wall, her face pale with terror as she realized their cover had been blown. Security personnel were moving through the clinic's corridors with the purposeful stride of men who'd been activated for a specific mission. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Miguel said, his hand moving instinctively toward the camera hidden beneath his jacket. The evidence he'd gathered was worthless if he didn't survive to publish it, but destroying the documentation meant condemning every player in those treatment rooms to continued pharmaceutical slavery. Dr. Herrera's laugh was cold and clinical. The only misunderstanding, Señor Santos, is your assumption that you would leave here alive. We know exactly who you are, exactly what you've been investigating, and exactly why you're going to disappear tonight.